The ink on the divorce papers was barely dry when Raphael stripped Cheyenne of absolutely everything. He orchestrated a brutal financial blackout, taking the Manhattan penthouse, draining their joint offshore accounts, and locking down the summer home in the Hamptons. He smugly handed her a meager, insulting settlement, convinced he had masterminded the perfect exit to start a glamorous new life with a woman 12 years her junior. Raphael thought he had successfully stolen the crown jewel of their marriage, their $50 million real estate empire. But in his blinding, narcissistic arrogance, he overlooked one tiny, catastrophic detail buried in a decade-old legal file. He completely forgot whose name was actually on the incorporation papers. The Tuesday evening it all fell apart began like any other in the sprawling Upper East Side apartment Cheyenne and Raphael Turner shared. The rain was beating lightly against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, blurring the city lights into a smear of gold and silver. Cheyenne Scott stood in the kitchen, pouring a glass of Cabernet, mentally reviewing the quarterly tax filings for Crestview Property Management. For 12 years, Cheyenne had been the invisible engine of their marriage and their business. She was the one who balanced the ledgers, negotiated with hostile contractors, and managed the grueling logistics, while Raphael played the charismatic frontman, wooing investors over expensive scotch and prime rib. When the front door clicked open, Cheyenne didn't look up from her iPad. "There's leftover risotto in the fridge," she called out, tapping a cell on her spreadsheet. "I'm not hungry," Raphael replied. His voice was entirely devoid of its usual booming warmth. It was flat, clinical, and sharp enough to make Cheyenne finally raise her head. He stood in the archway of the kitchen, flanked not by his usual leather briefcase, but by two large, sleek Rimowa suitcases. He was dressed in his custom navy Brioni suit, every inch the successful, self-made titan he believed himself to be. But it was the coldness in his eyes that made Cheyenne's breath hitch in her throat. "Raphael, what's going on? Are you traveling? I didn't see anything on the calendar." "I'm leaving, Cheyenne," he said, stepping fully into the kitchen. He didn't approach her. He maintained a calculated, physical distance, as if she were an employee he was about to terminate. "I've filed for divorce. My lawyers will be in touch with yours, assuming you retain one quickly. I suggest you do." Cheyenne stared at him, the glass of wine trembling in her hand, before she carefully set it down on the marble island. "Is this a joke? Raphael, we have a board meeting on Thursday. What do you mean you've filed for divorce?" "I mean exactly what I said," he replied, checking his Rolex, a gift Cheyenne had bought him for their 10th anniversary. "I've outgrown this marriage. I've outgrown you, frankly. The paperwork was filed this morning in New York County Supreme Court. I am taking up residence at the Plaza until the closing on my new condo is finalized." The words hit her like physical blows. There had been no screaming matches, no therapy sessions, no warning signs other than his increasing late nights at the office, which he always blamed on the new commercial acquisitions in Brooklyn. "You're leaving me?" Cheyenne's voice was a barely audible whisper. "Just like that? After 12 years? Don't make this hysterical, Cheyenne. It's an executive decision. It's best for both of us." He pulled an envelope from his breast pocket and tossed it onto the kitchen island. It landed with a heavy, dismissive thud next to her iPad. "These are the preliminary filings. Read them. And Cheyenne? You have until Friday to vacate the apartment. The lease is solely in my name, and I've already informed building management that your access will be revoked." "You can't do that," she gasped, the shock slowly giving way to a rising tide of panic. "This is my home. We built everything together. Crestview. I built Crestview," Raphael interrupted, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "I am the face, the founder, and the driving force. You kept the books. You were glorified administrative support, Cheyenne. Do not flatter yourself by thinking you are an equal partner in my empire." Before she could form a coherent response, Raphael turned on his heel. He grabbed the handles of his luggage and walked out the door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind him with an agonizing finality. Cheyenne stood frozen for a long time, the silence of the massive apartment pressing in on her. When she finally moved, her hands shook uncontrollably as she tore open the heavy linen envelope. The legal jargon blurred together, but the demands were crystal clear. Raphael was seeking full ownership of Crestview Property Management. He was citing her limited contribution to the marriage's financial assets. In a daze, she opened her laptop to check their joint Chase accounts. Access denied. Please contact your administrator. She tried the Vanguard investment portfolio. Invalid credentials. He had spent weeks, perhaps months, meticulously planning this. He had moved funds, locked accounts, and changed passwords. He had surgically removed her from the financial infrastructure of their shared life before he ever packed a bag. Cheyenne sank to the cold hardwood floor of the kitchen, pulling her knees to her chest. She didn't cry. The betrayal was too deep, too systemic for tears. It was a suffocating, heavy realization that the man she had loved and served for over a decade had just executed a hostile takeover of her life. 3 weeks later, the reality of Raphael's ruthlessness was on full display in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of Penhaligon and Associates, a top-tier law firm in Midtown Manhattan. Cheyenne sat rigidly in a leather chair, wearing a simple beige trench coat over a sensible dress. She had spent the last 3 weeks sleeping on a friend's sofa in Astoria, surviving on takeout and sheer adrenaline. Across the sprawling mahogany table sat Raphael. He looked exceptionally relaxed, radiating a smug confidence. Beside him was Arthur Penhaligon, a notoriously aggressive divorce attorney known in New York legal circles as the Butcher. Arthur was a man who took immense pleasure in financially dissecting spouses. And then there was the new addition. Sitting just behind Raphael, observing the proceedings with a thinly veiled smirk, was Chloe Dawson. Chloe was 25, a former junior marketing executive at Crestview, whom Cheyenne had personally trained. She had flawless, blowout blonde hair, a perfectly tailored Chanel suit, and rested a proprietary hand on the back of Raphael's chair. Seeing her there, flaunting the affair with such brazen entitlement, made Cheyenne's stomach violently churn. It all made sickening sense now. The late nights, the sudden trips to scout properties. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries, shall we?" Arthur Penhaligon drawled, leaning forward and adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. He didn't even acknowledge Cheyenne's hastily hired, overworked attorney, a timid man named David who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "My client is prepared to offer a highly generous settlement to expedite this dissolution." Arthur slid a thick-bound document across the polished wood. $50,000 in transitional alimony, paid over 6 months, Arthur stated, his tone flat. "A lump sum of $100,000 to assist Ms. Scott in securing permanent housing. Furthermore, Mr. Turner will generously absorb the remaining lease payments on the Honda Civic currently in her possession." Cheyenne stared at the document. $150,000, she repeated, her voice remarkably steady, despite the hurricane of rage inside her. "Crestview is valued at roughly $50 million. We have 14 commercial properties in Manhattan and Brooklyn. We have liquid assets in the millions." "Correction," Arthur smiled, a chilling, predatory stretching of his lips. "Mr. Turner has a $50 million company. You, Miss Scott, were merely a salaried employee who happened to share his bed. A salary, I might add, that was well above market rate for a glorified bookkeeper. You have no equity. You have no foundational claim to the business assets. I built that company with him, Cheyenne's voice finally raised, echoing off the glass walls. When we started, Raphael had nothing. I used my savings to secure our first duplex in Williamsburg. I wrote the business plan. I managed every contractor, every tenant dispute, and every tax audit for 10 years. Raphael let out a soft, patronizing sigh. He looked at Cheyenne as if she were a delusional child throwing a tantrum in a high-end restaurant. "Cheyenne, please," Raphael said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You answered phones. You paid invoices. I was the visionary. I took the risks. I shook the hands that got us the capital. Don't embarrass yourself by pretending you understand high-level commercial real estate." He reached back, and Chloe's hand slipped into his. He gave it a gentle squeeze. "Chloe here closed 3 deals last quarter that generated more revenue than your entire administrative department did in a year." Cheyenne felt a hot flush of humiliation burn her cheeks. Chloe simply offered a pathetic, sympathetic tilt of her head, which was somehow worse than open hostility. "My client is offering you a clean break, Ms. Scott," Arthur intervened, tapping his Mont Blanc pen on the table. "If you choose to fight this, I assure you, we will tie you up in litigation for years. We will audit your personal expenses. We will bleed you dry in legal fees until you have nothing left but debt. Take the money. Sign the non-disclosure agreement regarding the company's internal practices and walk away." Cheyenne's attorney, David, leaned over and whispered frantically in her ear. "Cheyenne, you have no money to fight them. They have the war chest. If you take this to trial, he'll outspend us 10 to 1. It might be best to take the settlement and try to negotiate the lump sum up to 200,000. Cheyenne looked at David, then back at Raphael. Raphael was already checking his phone, completely disengaged, confident that the slaughter was over. He had reduced 12 years of her blood, sweat, and absolute devotion to a rounding error in his checkbook. He was throwing her away, replacing her with a younger model, and keeping the empire she had painstakingly managed behind the scenes. She felt small, defeated. The sheer weight of his power and money was suffocating. She reached out, her fingers brushing the thick, expensive paper of the settlement agreement. Arthur Penhaligon helpfully clicked a pen and slid it toward her. Cheyenne picked up the pen. She stared at the signature line. "I, Cheyenne Scott, hereby forfeit any and all claims to Crestview Property Management." Suddenly, a memory flickered in her mind. A distant, dusty memory from a cramped, stifling hot studio apartment in Brooklyn 12 years ago. A memory of a stack of legal papers, a notary public, and a hushed conversation about credit scores and liabilities. Cheyenne's hand froze. The pen hovered a millimeter above the paper. She looked up at Raphael. He was still looking at his phone, a slight smile on his face, probably texting his broker. He was so secure in his narrative. He truly believed he was the sole master of his universe. Cheyenne slowly set the pen down. "I need some time to review this," she said quietly. Arthur sighed heavily, rolling his eyes. "Ms. Scott, this offer expires at 5 p.m. on Friday. After that, we retract the financial assistance and see you in court." "Friday is fine," Cheyenne said, standing up and smoothing her coat. She didn't look at Chloe. She didn't look at her own pathetic lawyer. She looked directly at Raphael, who finally glanced up, annoyed by the delay. "I'll give you my answer by Friday." As she walked out of the glass boardroom, her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't defeated. She was waking up. The next morning, Cheyenne fired David, She couldn't afford a shark like Arthur Penhaligon, but she knew she needed someone smart, hungry, and entirely unimpressed by men like Raphael Turner. After hours of frantic internet research and calling in favors from old college friends, she found Sylvia Rothcroft. Sylvia operated out of a cramped, chaotic office in downtown Manhattan, surrounded by towering stacks of manila folders and half-empty coffee cups. Sylvia was in her late 50s, wore sensible orthopedic shoes, and possessed a mind like a steel trap. She had built a reputation for untangling complex corporate fraud cases. "So, he locked you out, drained the accounts, and offered you peanuts," Sylvia muttered, peering at Cheyenne over the rims of her reading glasses. A classic freeze-out, Penhaligon's signature move. "Tell me why you didn't sign." Cheyenne sat on the edge of her seat, clutching a battered waterproof hard drive she had managed to smuggle out of the apartment in her purse on the night Raphael kicked her out. It contained her personal backups of 10 years of files. "Because of how we started," Cheyenne said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anxiety and returning strength. "Sylvia, 12 years ago, Raphael was a mess. He had the charm, but he had just come off a failed restaurant venture. He had declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy. His credit score was completely destroyed. He couldn't even get a loan for a used car, let alone commercial real estate." Sylvia leaned back, her eyes narrowing with sudden, acute interest. "Go on." "When we found our first property, the duplex in Williamsburg, the bank laughed him out of the room," Cheyenne continued, her memories crystallizing, becoming sharper by the second. "I had a perfect credit score. I had savings from my corporate job. So we used my credentials. But it wasn't just the mortgage." Cheyenne plugged the hard drive into her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard, desperately searching through archived folders from 2014. "We formed an LLC to protect our personal assets," Cheyenne explained, her heart beating faster as she opened a folder labeled Founding Docs. "Do not delete." Raphael insisted on calling it Crestview, after the street he grew up on. But because of his bankruptcy, the corporate attorney warned us that having Raphael listed as an owner or officer would trigger massive red flags for commercial lenders and insurance companies. "So," Sylvia breathed, leaning forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Who incorporated the LLC?" "I did," Cheyenne said. She clicked open a PDF file, a scanned document bearing the faded stamp of the New York Department of State. She turned the laptop around. Sylvia pulled her glasses down and read the screen. The room went completely silent, save for the hum of the office air conditioner. Sylvia read the document once. Then she read it again. A slow, terrifying grin began to spread across the older lawyer's face. "Miss Scott," Sylvia whispered, tapping a jagged fingernail against the screen. "Do you know what this is?" "It's the Articles of Organization for Crestview Property Management, LLC, Cheyenne replied. "Yes, and according to this state-certified, legally binding document, Crestview is a single-member LLC. Sylvia looked up, her eyes gleaming with predatory delight. And that single member, holding 100% of the equity, the sole authorized signatory, and the absolute legal owner, is Cheyenne Jane Scott. Cheyenne let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 weeks. He never changed it. He couldn't, Sylvia said, rapidly typing on her own computer, accessing state business registries. Once a company scales, changing the fundamental ownership structure requires massive legal restructuring, tax reassessments, and notifying all lenders. He was too busy playing the big shot to bother with the tedious paperwork. Let me check the current state registry. Sylvia hit enter. A few seconds later, she laughed out loud. It was a sharp, barking sound of pure joy. Active status. Registered agent, Cheyenne Scott. Sole managing member, Cheyenne Scott. Sylvia spun her monitor around. My dear, Raphael doesn't own a $50 million company. You own a $50 million company. Raphael is legally nothing more than an employee, an independent contractor at best. But he runs everything, Cheyenne said, her mind spinning with the implications. He signs the contracts. He issues the directives. How? Sylvia demanded. If he's not an officer, how does he have signing authority? Cheyenne frowned, thinking back to the mountain of paperwork she managed over the years. A proxy. We drafted a sweeping, general power of attorney regarding business operations for him in 2015, so he could execute contracts while I was working my day job. He just kept using it. A power of attorney, Sylvia said, her grin widening into something distinctly wicked. A proxy given by the owner to an agent. And do you know what the beautiful thing about a power of attorney is, Cheyenne? Cheyenne felt a fierce, burning heat rise in her chest. The ashes of her broken marriage were suddenly catching fire. It's revocable. Exactly, Sylvia purred. At any time, without notice, and without cause. Sylvia stood up and began pacing the small office, the gears in her mind turning at light speed. Penhaligon doesn't know. Penhaligon is an arrogant bastard who assumes the loud, rich man in the suit owns the toys. He didn't do his due diligence. He didn't pull the original state formation documents because Raphael told him he founded it, and Penhaligon took his wealthy client's word for it. Raphael believes his own lies, Cheyenne murmured, realizing the depth of her soon-to-be ex-husband's delusion. He has told the story of how he built Crestview from the ground up so many times, he literally forgot that on paper he doesn't exist. This is not a divorce settlement anymore, Cheyenne, Sylvia said, stopping and planting her hands firmly on her desk. This is a corporate reclamation. He wants to give you Friday at 5 p.m. to surrender your life? Sylvia hit a button on her intercom. Brenda, hold all my calls for the rest of the day and get me the forms for an emergency revocation of corporate proxy and a commercial eviction notice. Sylvia looked back at Cheyenne, her eyes burning with a fierce, vindictive light. We aren't going to reject his settlement, Cheyenne. We are going to fire him. We are going to seize every bank account, lock down every property, and terminate his access to the building. By Friday at 5 p.m., Raphael Turner won't even be able to buy a cup of coffee using company funds. Cheyenne looked at the laptop screen, at her own name typed in stark black ink. For the first time since Raphael walked out the door, the crushing weight on her chest lifted. The invisible, compliant wife was dead. The CEO of Crestview was ready to go to war. Draft the revocation, Sylvia, Cheyenne said, her voice cold, steady, and dripping with resolve. Let's take back my company. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in corporate warfare, orchestrated from the cramped, coffee-stained confines of Sylvia Rothcroft's office. Cheyenne didn't sleep. She existed on a potent cocktail of black espresso, sheer adrenaline, and the intoxicating, unfamiliar taste of taking her power back. Their first target was the financial nervous system of Crestview Property Management. On Wednesday morning, Cheyenne and Sylvia marched into the polished marble lobby of the Chase Commercial Banking branch in Lower Manhattan. Cheyenne wore a sharp, charcoal-gray blazer she had bought at a consignment shop the day before. She was done wearing the beige trench coat of a defeated wife. They sat in the plush office of Gregory Mitchell, a senior vice president of commercial accounts who had personally golfed with Raphael. Gregory offered them a practiced, sympathetic smile, clearly assuming Cheyenne was there to beg for a temporary line of credit amidst her messy divorce. "Cheyenne, it's good to see you," Gregory said smoothly, folding his hands over his mahogany desk. "Though I must admit, I was surprised by the appointment. Raphael usually handles the primary account directives." "That changes today, Gregory," Cheyenne said, her voice steady and commanding. She didn't break eye contact as Sylvia slid a thick, notarized dossier across the desk. "What's this?" Gregory asked, his smile faltering slightly. "That is a certified copy of the Articles of Organization for Crestview Property Management, LLC, proving that my client, Cheyenne Scott, is the sole managing member and 100% equity owner," Sylvia barked, leaning forward like a hawk eyeing a field mouse. "Attached is the immediate, irrevocable termination of the general power of attorney previously granted to Raphael Turner. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Mr. Turner has absolutely no legal authority to access, transfer, or view any funds associated with Crestview." Gregory scoffed lightly, reaching for the paperwork. "Ladies, please. Raphael is the CEO. We process millions of dollars a week under his signature. I can't just freeze the accounts of a major client based on a domestic dispute." "Read the charter, Gregory," Cheyenne said, her tone dropping to an icy calm. "Check your own internal system. Who is the guarantor on the original 2014 master account?" Gregory sighed, turning to his computer. He typed in the account numbers, his eyes scanning the screen. Slowly, the color began to drain from his face. The confident, patronizing banker vanished, replaced by a man staring down the barrel of massive institutional liability. "The guarantor is Cheyenne Scott," Gregory whispered, clicking his mouse frantically, trying to find Raphael's name anywhere in the foundational ownership architecture. "Mr. Turner is listed as an authorized agent, a proxy." "A proxy who has just been legally terminated," Sylvia snapped. "If you allow a single cent to move out of those accounts under Raphael Turner's directive after receiving this notice, we will hold this bank liable for corporate fraud. Freeze the accounts, Gregory. Issue new credentials. Now." By 11 a.m., the financial guillotine had fallen. The multi-million-dollar operating accounts, the tenant escrow accounts, and the payroll reserves were entirely locked behind Cheyenne's new biometric passwords. Their next stop was IT. Cheyenne drove to the Brooklyn offices of the managed IT service provider that handled Crestview's servers and communications. She presented the same bulletproof documentation to the head of security. Within 20 minutes, a remote wipe was initiated on Raphael's company-issued phone and laptop. His email access was severed. The digital keys to the kingdom were changed. Meanwhile, Raphael was entirely oblivious, insulated by his own arrogance. He was sitting in a trendy Williamsburg coffee shop with Chloe Dawson, celebrating. They were 3 blocks away from a massive commercial warehouse that Raphael was in the middle of acquiring to convert into luxury lofts. It was to be his crowning achievement, a $30 million deal. At 2:15 p.m., Raphael's cell phone rang. It was his lead real estate broker, frantic. "Raphael, what the hell is going on with the earnest money wire?" the broker shouted over the line. "The sellers are threatening to walk. The title company said Chase rejected the transfer. Insufficient authorization." Raphael frowned, waving off Chloe, who was showing him swatches of Italian marble on her iPad. "Calm down. It's just a banking glitch. Gregory Mitchell is probably out of the office. Let me call him directly." Raphael dialed Gregory's direct line. It rang 3 times before going to an assistant, who curtly informed him that Mr. Mitchell was unavailable and that all inquiries regarding Crestview accounts must now be directed to the sole managing member, Cheyenne Scott. "What?" Raphael snapped, his face flushing. He hung up and tried to open his Chase commercial app. Access denied. Credentials revoked. He tried to log into his company email to contact his CFO. Account disabled. Contact your administrator. A cold, creeping sensation began to crawl up the back of Raphael's neck. He looked at his phone, then at Chloe, who was watching him with wide, confused eyes. "Raphael? Baby, what's wrong?" "Nothing," he lied smoothly, though his heart was beginning to hammer. "Just a minor technical issue with the servers. Cheyenne is probably throwing a final tantrum, trying to mess with the utility accounts or something pathetic." He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "I'll have Penhaligon squash it tomorrow at the meeting. Let's go look at that marble." But deep down, a seed of panic had been planted. He spent the rest of Thursday aggressively calling his corporate lawyers, only to be met with automated voicemails and confused secretaries. The blackout was complete, and Raphael was entirely in the dark. The atmosphere in the boardroom of Penhaligon and Associates on Friday afternoon was suffocatingly tense. The 5 p.m. deadline Raphael had arbitrarily set to force Cheyenne's surrender was approaching. Raphael paced the length of the glass-walled room, checking his Rolex every 30 seconds. He looked unkempt. The custom Brioni suit was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. For 48 hours his credit cards had bounced, his emails had bounced, and every property manager he tried to call had awkwardly informed him that they were under new directives. Chloe sat in the corner, looking noticeably less glamorous than she had 3 days prior. She was furiously texting on her phone, anxiety radiating from her rigid posture. Arthur Penhaligon sat at the head of the table, polishing his gold-rimmed glasses with a silk handkerchief. "Sit down, Raphael. You're making me dizzy. The woman is simply trying to extort a few extra $1,000 before the deadline. It's a standard nuisance tactic. We will threaten her with a tortious interference lawsuit for the banking stunt, and she'll sign the settlement." "She locked me out of the main server, Arthur," Raphael barked, slamming his hands on the mahogany table. "The Brooklyn deal is bleeding out. If that earnest money doesn't hit escrow by Monday, I lose a $30 million acquisition." "You won't," Arthur said smoothly. "She's bluffing with a bad hand." At exactly 4:58 p.m., the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Raphael expected to see Cheyenne shuffling in with her head bowed, flanked by her stuttering, incompetent lawyer, David. Instead, Cheyenne walked in with her head held high, radiating a cold, absolute authority. And she wasn't with David. She was accompanied by Sylvia Rothcroft, who carried a thick leather briefcase and wore a terrifying, predatory smile. Arthur Penhaligon stopped polishing his glasses. He recognized Sylvia instantly. Every divorce shark in New York knew Sylvia Rothcroft. She was the woman you prayed wasn't sitting across the table when the stakes were high. "Sylvia," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its smug drawl. "What are you doing here?" "I'm representing Ms. Scott, Arthur," Sylvia said briskly, dropping her heavy briefcase onto the table with a loud thud. She didn't wait to be invited to sit. She pulled out a chair for Cheyenne and then took the one beside her. "And we are here because Mr. Turner requested an answer to his highly imaginative settlement offer by 5 o'clock. "Cheyenne, stop this nonsense," Raphael sneered, stepping forward, trying to physically intimidate her with his presence. "Turn the servers back on. Call the bank. You're violating a dozen corporate protocols, and I will personally see you prosecuted if you don't stop this tantrum." Cheyenne didn't flinch. She looked up at Raphael, studying the man she had served for 12 years. He looked small to her now. Stripped of his money and his unquestioned control, he was just an angry, aging man in a wrinkled suit. "I'm afraid I have rejected your settlement, Raphael," Cheyenne said smoothly. Arthur Penhaligon sighed, pulling out a fresh legal pad. Fine. What is your counter-offer, Ms. Rothcroft? Let's not waste each other's billing hours. We don't have a counter-offer, Arthur, Sylvia said, popping the latches on her briefcase, because my client doesn't need to negotiate for assets she already owns in their entirety. Sylvia pulled out a stack of documents, sliding the first one across the table to Arthur. What is this? Arthur demanded. That is a certified copy of the original 2014 State Charter for Crestview Property Management, LLC, Sylvia replied, leaning back and crossing her arms. I strongly suggest you read Section 3, specifically the clauses regarding ownership and equity distribution. Arthur put his glasses back on and picked up the paper. Raphael scoffed, crossing his arms. It's the charter, so what? We filed it together. Actually, Raphael, you didn't, Cheyenne corrected him, her voice ringing clear in the silent room. You were an undischarged bankrupt with a credit score in the low 5s. No bank would touch you. The corporate attorney advised us to keep your name entirely off the foundational documents to secure the commercial mortgages. Arthur's eyes were darting rapidly across the page. His jaw slowly slackened. He looked up at Raphael, then back down at the paper. Then over to Sylvia. Raphael. Arthur's voice was barely a whisper. Did you ever amend this charter? Did you ever draft an operating agreement, transferring equity to yourself once your bankruptcy was cleared? No, I was too busy building the actual company to worry about administrative paperwork, Raphael exploded. She was the bookkeeper. She handled that. And I handled it exactly as it was originally drafted, Cheyenne said softly. Raphael, Arthur said, his tone turning remarkably sharp, entirely devoid of its usual deference. According to the state of New York, you own exactly 0% of Crestview Property Management. The words hung in the air like a suspended executioner's blade. Chloe Dawson gasped aloud, dropping her phone onto the table. That's a lie, Raphael shouted, his face turning a deep, alarming shade of crimson. I am the CEO. I sign the contracts. I execute the acquisitions. I have a standing power of attorney. Had, Sylvia corrected him with a vicious grin. She slid a second document across the table. As of Wednesday morning, that power of attorney has been legally revoked by the sole managing member. The bank has been notified. The IT vendors have been notified. The property managers have been notified. Sylvia pulled out a third, final envelope and pushed it directly toward Raphael. And this, Sylvia announced, her voice echoing with utter finality, is your formal notice of termination, Mr. Turner, along with a termination notice for Miss Dawson. You are both fired, effectively immediately, for gross misappropriation of company funds to finance a personal affair, and for attempting to fraudulently claim ownership of a corporate entity. Raphael stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute, unassailable reality of his situation was crashing down on him. He had spent weeks planning to throw his wife out onto the street with nothing. Instead, he had just handed her the keys to a $50 million empire while legally excising himself from it. You can't do this, Raphael choked out, looking frantically at Arthur. Arthur, do something! Sue her! File an injunction! Arthur Penhaligon, however, was a shark, and sharks only swim with the living. He looked at the legally binding, state-certified documents on the table, and then he looked at the sweating, panicked, completely broke man standing next to him. Raphael, Arthur said coldly, closing his legal pad and capping his Mont Blanc pen. I am retained by the CEO of Crestview, which paid my retainer. It appears that CEO is Ms. Scott, and since you have no personal assets, no equity, and as of this moment, no income. Arthur stood up and straightened his tie. I suggest you find a pro bono attorney, because I don't work for free. Cheyenne watched as the blood completely drained from Raphael's face. He staggered backward, catching himself on the edge of the mahogany table. Chloe, realizing she had hitched her wagon to a man who had just been reduced to absolute zero, quietly stood up, grabbed her Chanel bag, and slipped out the glass doors without saying a single word to him. Cheyenne stood up, buttoning her blazer. The corporate exorcism was complete. "You wanted me out of the apartment by Friday, Raphael," Cheyenne said, her voice devoid of anger, echoing only with absolute triumph. "The apartment is leased under your name. You can keep it. But considering your credit cards are currently frozen and you have no salary to pay the $30,000 monthly rent, I suggest you start packing those Rimowa suitcases." She turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving Raphael Turner standing entirely alone in the wreckage of his own arrogant design. The weekend following the boardroom massacre was a masterclass in swift, merciless corporate restructuring. Cheyenne Scott did not simply take the reins of Crestview Property Management. She ripped them out of the wall and rewired the entire machine. By Monday morning, every property manager, contractor, and vendor had received a formal, notarized memorandum. Raphael Turner was permanently severed from the company. Raphael, meanwhile, was experiencing a rapid, agonizing descent into a reality he had spent 12 years ignoring. He spent Saturday night frantically dialing every wealthy contact in his phone book, begging for a bridge loan, a temporary favor, or just a couch to sleep on. The responses were universally cold. New York high society and commercial real estate circles were incestuous and gossipy. Word of his spectacular public defenestration at the hands of his bookkeeper wife and Arthur Penhaligon's abrupt resignation had spread like wildfire. To them, Raphael wasn't a victim. He was a liability. A man who didn't even own the company he boasted about was a man nobody wanted to do business with. By Tuesday, Raphael had resorted to pawning his collection of vintage Rolex watches just to retain a mid-tier, overly aggressive litigation attorney named Harrison Ford, a man who promised Raphael he could reclaim his empire through a concept called sweat equity. "We sue her for constructive trust and unjust enrichment," Harrison told Raphael in a dingy office that smelled faintly of stale cigars, a far cry from Penhaligon's glass tower. "You built the business. You were the face. You have emails, text messages, and a decade of public appearances proving you acted as the CEO. We argue that despite the paperwork, there was an implied marital partnership. We freeze her assets with an injunction." Raphael's eyes lit up with a manic, desperate hope. "Yes, exactly. I did the work. She just sat at a desk. File the injunction. I want her locked out of the Chase accounts by Friday." But Raphael, blinded by his bruised ego and rising panic, had forgotten one crucial, catastrophic detail about his own past, a detail Sylvia Rothcroft had already anticipated, researched, and weaponized. The battleground shifted to the New York County Supreme Court, where Harrison Ford filed an emergency motion for a preliminary injunction to freeze Crestview's assets, claiming Raphael was the de facto 50-50 owner through sweat equity and marital contribution. Cheyenne sat in the courtroom on a rainy Thursday morning, her posture perfect, wearing a sharp navy suit. Sylvia sat beside her, radiating a terrifying, absolute calm. Across the aisle, Raphael looked haggard. His suit was slightly rumpled, his hair unkempt, and his leg bounced with a nervous, frantic energy. Chloe Dawson was nowhere to be seen. She had packed her bags and blocked his number the moment she realized his credit cards were declining at Nobu. When the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Honorable Beatrice Caldwell, called the hearing to order, Harrison Ford launched into a passionate, booming monologue. He painted Raphael as the visionary martyr, the true creator of the $50 million empire, who was being cruelly victimized by a vindictive wife exploiting a clerical technicality. Your Honor, my client poured 12 years of his life, his connections, and his genius into Crestview, Harrison declared, gesturing dramatically to Raphael. To deny him his rightful half of the equity based on a decade-old piece of paper is a gross miscarriage of equity and justice. He is the lifeblood of that company. Judge Caldwell peered over her glasses at Sylvia. Ms. Rothcroft, do you have a response to this claim of implied partnership and sweat equity? I do, Your Honor, Sylvia said, standing up smoothly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply walked to the clerk and handed over a thick, bound dossier. In fact, I have a response directly from Mr. Turner himself, a legally binding, sworn statement under penalty of perjury. Raphael frowned, leaning forward. Harrison looked suddenly uneasy. What is this, counsel? Judge Caldwell asked, flipping open the dossier. That, Your Honor, is the transcript and final judgment of Mr. Turner's Chapter 7 bankruptcy proceedings from 2014, precisely the time Crestview Property Management was founded by my client, Cheyenne Scott, Sylvia stated, her voice ringing clearly through the quiet courtroom. Sylvia turned to look directly at Raphael, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. During those proceedings, Mr. Turner's creditors aggressively sought to liquidate any hidden assets he might possess. To protect himself from paying his debts, Mr. Turner testified, under oath in federal bankruptcy court, that he had absolutely zero equity, zero ownership, and zero implied financial interest in Crestview Property Management. The color entirely drained from Raphael's face. He stopped breathing. Furthermore, Sylvia continued, twisting the knife with surgical precision, Mr. Turner signed a sworn affidavit stating that he was merely an independent contractor, working for Ms. Scott on a commission-only basis, to ensure his creditors couldn't touch the company's revenue. He legally shielded himself from his own bankruptcy by explicitly, legally disavowing the very sweat equity he is attempting to claim today. Judge Caldwell's eyes widened as she read the highlighted sections of the federal transcript. She looked up at Raphael, her expression hardening into absolute ice. Mr. Ford, Judge Caldwell said, her voice dripping with judicial venom. Is your client attempting to commit perjury in my courtroom today, or did he commit federal bankruptcy fraud in 2014? Because he cannot have it both ways. He cannot claim he was entirely separate from the company to avoid his lawful creditors, and then suddenly claim he is a 50% owner to extort his soon-to-be ex-wife. Harrison Ford began to aggressively shuffle his papers, visibly sweating. Your Honor, the circumstances of the bankruptcy were complex. They are not complex, Counselor. They are a matter of federal record, Judge Caldwell snapped, slamming the dossier shut. Your client legally declared he had no interest in this company to save his own skin. Judicial estoppel prevents him from taking a contradictory position, now simply because it benefits his divorced settlement. Motion for injunction denied, completely and with prejudice. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Raphael slumped into his chair, the final crushing weight of his own hubris collapsing his lungs. He had built his own cage. He had woven the very legal trap that was now suffocating him. He looked over at Cheyenne, desperate for a shred of the soft, compliant woman he had married. But she wasn't looking at him. She was packing her briefcase, her face a mask of serene, untouchable power. 6 months had passed since the resounding crack of the gavel in Judge Caldwell's courtroom, but for Cheyenne Scott, it felt as though an entire lifetime had unfolded. The Manhattan skyline glittered brightly outside the newly renovated top-floor executive suite of Crestview Property Management, the oppressive, heavy mahogany furniture that Raphael had always favored, the dark leather chairs that swallowed you whole, the intimidating, oversized desk that screamed of fragile, overcompensating ego, was completely gone. In its place, Cheyenne had designed a sanctuary of transparency and light, sleek glass surfaces, bright, natural lighting, and vibrant abstract art breathed life into the room. It was no longer a fortress built on deception and posturing. It was a modern, thriving command center. Cheyenne sat behind her minimalist desk, the afternoon sun catching the subtle silver threads in her tailored blazer, feeling a profound sense of peace she hadn't known in over a decade. Spread out before her were the final, voluminous closing documents for the $30 million Williamsburg warehouse acquisition. It was the very same deal Raphael had been hyperventilating over on the day she systematically dismantled his life. When Raphael had abruptly vanished from the negotiations, locked out of his own emails and bank accounts, the sellers had understandably panicked, threatening to pull out entirely. But Cheyenne hadn't lost the deal. She hadn't sent a proxy or a fast-talking broker. Instead, she had requested a face-to-face meeting. Sitting across from the skeptical developers, Cheyenne had simply opened her laptop and walked them through a decade of Crestview's meticulously maintained ledgers, flawless tax histories, and highly accurate projected ROI models. She didn't rely on aggressive charm or empty bravado. She relied on undeniable competence. She showed them that she wasn't just the invisible bankroll behind the curtain. She was the engine, the architect, and the brain trust. The sellers had been so deeply impressed by her quiet, terrifying command of the numbers that they eagerly signed the preliminary papers with her that very afternoon. A soft, rhythmic knock on the frosted glass door pulled Cheyenne from her memories. Sylvia Rothcroft strolled in, looking just as sharp and formidable as the day they first met in her cramped downtown office. Today, however, the trademark predatory gleam in Sylvia's eye had softened into a deeply satisfied warmth. In her hands, she carried a thin manila folder. She didn't say a word at first, simply walking across the plush carpet and dropping the folder onto Cheyenne's glass desk with a definitive, satisfying thud. "It's done," Sylvia announced, taking a seat in one of the comfortable cream-colored armchairs opposite Cheyenne. She crossed her legs and offered a wide, triumphant smile. "The judge signed the final decree this morning, Cheyenne. You are officially, legally, and permanently an unmarried woman." Cheyenne reached out, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the folder. She exhaled a long, shaky breath, letting the residual tension of the last half-year finally bleed out of her shoulders and evaporate into the sunlit room. Opening the cover, she stared at the stark legal terminology, the official stamps, and her own name, completely untethered from Raphael Turner's. "And the settlement?" Cheyenne asked, her voice steady, though a flicker of anticipation danced in her chest. "Exactly as we dictated," Sylvia grinned, leaning back and resting her hands in her lap. "He gets absolutely nothing from Crestview, not a single dime of alimony or transitional support, considering his independent contractor status was terminated with documented cause regarding his gross misappropriation of company funds. The judge did, however, generously award him the lease on that absurd Upper East Side penthouse, along with all the massive accumulating arrears he's racked up since you legally stopped paying it for him months ago." Cheyenne looked up from the papers. The searing anger that had fueled her through the initial days of the separation had completely burned away, leaving behind a state of profound, untouchable indifference. "Where is he now?" she asked, genuinely curious about the final mechanics of his downfall. "He declared bankruptcy again," Sylvia chuckled darkly, a sound completely devoid of pity. Only this time it's real. There is no Cheyenne Scott to shield his assets and prop up his credit score. Harrison Ford dropped him the second his desperate retainer check bounced. The entire high society facade collapsed. Last I heard through the grapevine, he's renting a cramped, walk-up studio deep in Queens. He's trying to hustle as a mid-level commercial broker for a bottom-tier, boutique firm that specializes in leasing suburban strip malls. His reputation in Manhattan is completely radioactive. No one will take his calls, let alone trust him with a commercial deal. Cheyenne nodded slowly, turning her chair slightly to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below, a city she now owned a very tangible, extremely profitable piece of. Raphael had tried to reduce her to nothing. He had tried to discard her like an obsolete piece of office equipment to fund his midlife crisis with a younger woman. But in his arrogant rush to steal the crown, he had completely forgotten who actually built the kingdom, stone by stone, who held the master keys, and who possessed the quiet, terrifying strength to lock him out of it forever. She picked up her customized gold pen, turned her attention back to the massive Williamsburg acquisition documents, and signed her name with a bold, uncompromising flourish. "Thank you, Sylvia." "For everything," Cheyenne said, smiling brightly as she closed the file. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a $50 million empire to run." Cheyenne Scott's story is a profound, dramatic testament to the fatal danger of underestimating the quiet architect behind a loud facade. Raphael Turner believed his own manufactured myth, assuming his charisma and suits were the true currency of their success, while blinding himself to the absolute legal and financial reality of his own making. In his narcissistic attempt to execute a hostile takeover of Cheyenne's life, he triggered his own spectacular corporate and personal demise. True power rarely needs to shout. It lives in the meticulous details, the unglamorous hard work, and the undeniable truth of the paperwork. Cheyenne didn't just survive her husband's brutal betrayal. She weaponized his own arrogance against him, reclaiming her identity, her dignity, and her $50 million empire, proving that the woman who builds the castle ultimately decides who gets thrown in the moat.